The single candle guttered when the Duke stepped into the servants' hall. He did not sit. He watched her sew. Hephzibah Sackville did not lift her eyes from the black morning shirt on her lap. Her needle went in, came out, went in again. A black ribbon was tied around her right wrist. Her biscuit-colored sleeve was frayed at the cuff. She was 23, and she had buried her father a fortnight earlier, and she was mending the linen of a man whose name she had only spoken once. Lucius Heathcote, 5th Duke of Rushmere, leaned on an ebony cane because his right knee had not forgiven Waterloo. The signet ring on his smallest finger caught the candle. He offered her the post of housekeeper of Rushmere Hall in 3 quiet sentences. She set the needle down. She asked, in return, that the sealed windows of the west wing be opened again. He looked at her for a long moment, then he agreed. Weeks later, in the library, searching for a book that had belonged to his dead mother, the Duke broke the seal on a letter that had waited 14 years for him. What he read there about the girl mending shirts in his servants' hall. Before the story begins, comment down below where you are watching from and what time it is there. If stories of justice, dignity, and love that arrives against all odds move you, leave a like. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and click join to become a member and help our channel. The single candle on the sewing table at Rushmere Hall guttered once, and Hephzibah Sackville did not look up. Her needle, threaded with black silk, moved through the cuff of a gentleman's morning shirt as steadily as breath. The biscuit-colored wool of her dress had been brushed that morning. The collar of unbleached linen turned twice to hide the yellowing edge. A black ribbon was tied at her right wrist. She had worn it for 10 months and 3 days. March of the year 1817 had come in upon Staffordshire with a grey rain that did not stop. The west wing of Rushmere Hall lay sealed behind oak shutters, nailed shut in the late Duchess's last winter, and the long picture gallery beyond Hephzibah's door smelled of cold stone and tallow. The great house had once been the pride of the county. Now its chimneys smoked badly, its tenant rents fell short, and most of its rooms slept under Holland sheets like furniture in a tomb. She set another stitch. Outside, the rain thickened. A door opened far down the corridor. A boot struck the flagstones, then dragged. Strike, drag, strike, drag. The cadence of a man who would not admit to limping. Hephzibah's hand did not pause, but her shoulders drew a half-inch straighter against the back of the rush-bottomed chair. She knew that step. The whole household knew it. The 5th Duke of Rushmere had come back from Brussels 2 years since with a Bonapartist ball lodged behind his right knee. The surgeon had taken the ball out at a field hospital near Mont Saint-Jean. The stiffness he had brought home with him. He came into the small parlor without knocking. He never knocked in his own house. Hephzibah rose, set the shirt aside with the needle still in it, and made her curtsy. It was a precise curtsy, neither deep enough to mock nor shallow enough to offend. "Mrs. Sackville, Your Grace." Lucius Heathcote stood a moment in the doorway, filling it. He was very tall. The black coat fitted him as though cut upon his back. The gray silk waistcoat bore a fine black thread. His cravat was tied in the simple knot of a man who did not need cleverness to be obeyed. He had laid his ebony cane across his left forearm. The silver lion's head caught the candlelight. His eyes were the color of polished steel and gave away nothing. The scar through the left eyebrow looked older than the rest of his face. "You are still working at this hour." "There is light enough, Your Grace." "There is not." He crossed to the table in 3 of those uneven strides and looked down at the shirt. "My valet was to send these to the village seamstress. Mr. Bristow was good enough to bring them to me instead, as I was not yet abed. And Mr. Bristow knew you would refuse the fee." She did not answer that. The fee had been a half-crown. Mr. Bristow had pressed it into her palm at the kitchen door, and she had set it on the dresser of his wife, who was lying in. The Duke lifted the shirt between his thumb and finger. The mended cuff turned to the light. The stitches were so small they could not be counted. He laid it down again. "How long have you been in this house?" 6 weeks, Your Grace. "Mrs. Bramwell tells me you mend in the small hours so that the chambermaids may sleep. Mrs. Bramwell is too kind." "Mrs. Bramwell is never kind." A pause. "She is honest." He moved to the hearth, where the fire was a knot of red coals and a few sticks of damp apple wood. He set the cane against the chimney-piece and held one ungloved hand out to the warmth. The signet on his smallest finger threw a brief gold spark. Hephzibah took up her work again. She would not stand idle while a duke stood by his own fire. "You were a milliner's apprentice in Lichfield," he said, without turning. "A mantua maker's, Your Grace, in Stafford. And before that?" The needle slipped a stitch. She corrected it without looking. "Before that, my father kept a small living in the parish of Abbots Bromley. A clergyman? Yes. He died at Michaelmas. In September, your grace. And your mother before him. When I was a child. He turned at that. The gray eyes rested on her for what felt like a long count of 3. There was no pity in them, which was a mercy. Pity from above was the worst of all charities. Mrs. Sackville, he said, my housekeeper has given notice. She is to be married at Lady Day to a chandler in Burton. I am told you have managed her keys for a fortnight already, without complaint and without instruction. Mrs. Hodge has been unwell. Mrs. Hodge has been gone to Burton. She has not been in this house since the 2nd of February. The keys were laid on the dresser one morning, and you took them up because no one else would. A flush rose in her throat. She set the needle down. She did not deny it. I propose, said the Duke, very evenly, that you take the post in name. The wage is £28 a year, and your board. The rooms above the still room would be yours. There are 16 indoor servants to govern, and the laundry, and the linen. Mr. Ashworth keeps the accounts of the estate. You would keep the accounts of the house. Mrs. Bramwell would answer to you, and I am told she has agreed to it, which is a thing I had not seen her agree to in 29 years. The room was silent but for the slow tick of damp wood in the grate. Hephzibah folded her hands in her lap. The fingertips of her right hand had been pricked so many times that the calluses had calluses. She felt them now, hard against the soft of her palm. Your grace does me too much honor. I do you exactly the honor you are owed. The matter is one of arithmetic. He did not smile. He almost never smiled, she had observed. When he did, it was a small thing kept on the left side of his mouth and quickly put away. I am not in the habit of asking twice. I have one condition, your grace. The Duke turned fully then, both hands behind his back. The lion's head of the cane was held loose in his right. He had not expected a condition. She watched him register that he had not, and then conceal it. Name it. She rose. She was small beside him. Her dark hair, parted at the center and pinned in a low knot at the nape, came no higher than the 3rd button of his waistcoat. The candle threw her shadow long upon the wainscot behind her. The west wing, your grace. The shutters of the late Duchess's morning room. The orangery. The rose garden beyond. They have been sealed for 2 years and 4 months. If I am to be mistress of the indoor work of this house, I shall need the keys to those doors, and the nails drawn from the shutters. The gray eyes did not move from her face. She drew a small breath and went on, because to stop now would have been to lose. The damp is coming in along the east cornice of the orangery, your grace. I have seen the stain on the outside. Another winter sealed and it will bring the ceiling down. The room cannot be left as it is. I do not ask for it to be lived in. I ask for it to be opened. A muscle moved at the hinge of his jaw. The cane rocked once in his hand, then was still. She had said too much. She thought she had said too much. She had named the late Duchess's morning room in the same breath as a stain on a ceiling, and any servant in this county would have known better. The fire collapsed quietly in upon itself. You have been into that wing. I have walked past it, your grace, outside on the gravel, and looked up. Yes. He set the cane back against the chimney-piece. He crossed to the long sash window and stood with his back to her, hands clasped behind. The rain ran in steady fingers down the dark glass. She could see the line of his shoulders against it. She could not see his face. My mother kept her roses in that garden, he said at last. She had a yellow one she called the Aurora. It would not winter without coddling. The gardener used to wrap the canes in straw in October and unwrap them in March. She was alive in March, the last time. He did not turn round. I gave the order to nail the shutters the day after we buried her. I did not give the order to leave them nailed. That was cowardice, my own. Hephzibah did not move. To speak would have been to intrude upon a thing not offered to her. Mrs. Sackville, he said, still to the window, you shall have your keys. Mr. Ashworth shall send to the carpenter at Cheadle to draw the nails before Lady Day. The orangery shall be opened, and the morning room aired, and the canes of any rose that has lived through 2 winters under straw shall be cut back to a hand's height and watered. If they live, they live. If they do not, we shall have lost a garden that was already lost. Yes, your grace. And you accept the post. I accept the post. He turned. The gray eyes had altered, not warmed, settled, as though some weight he had been carrying badly at the shoulder had been shifted to a place it could be carried. Then we have a bargain, Mrs. Sackville, she curtsied. He inclined his head, neither more nor less than a duke owed his upper servant. He took up his cane. He went out of the room with the same uneven step, strike and drag, down the long flagstones of the corridor, and the sound of it stayed in the small parlor after he was gone. Hephzibah stood a moment by the chair. Then she sat. She took up the morning shirt and the needle, and she set the next stitch. Her hand was perfectly steady. It was her breath that had gone short. She finished the cuff before she allowed herself to weep, and she wept in absolute silence, because a clergyman's daughter weeps as she prays, without disturbance to the house. The next morning the rain had slackened to a fine wet mist. Mrs. Bramwell came up from the kitchen at 6:30 with a cup of dark tea, and set it upon the still-room dresser with a small wooden bang that said more than speech. So, the cook's face was red from the fire, her eyes sharp in their pads of flesh. You are to be Mrs. Sackville, the housekeeper now, and not Mrs. Sackville, the seamstress in the parlor. His Grace told me at the small hours of the night, in the library, with a glass of brandy in his hand and his bad leg up on the fender. I have known him since he was 9, and I will tell you plainly, miss, he does not do a thing of that sort lightly. I shall try to deserve it, Mrs. Bramwell. You shall try nothing, you shall do it. The cook took up the cup again, held it out. Drink. You are thin as a wren, and the day is long. The carpenter is coming at noon to draw the nails of the west wing. His Grace sent the boy with the note at 5 o'clock this morning. He had not been to bed. Hephzibah took the cup. The tea was scalding and very strong. Mrs. Bramwell, why is he opening the wing? The cook looked at her a long moment. Then she said, in a voice surprisingly soft for a woman of her shape, because you asked him. No one has asked him for anything in 2 years and 4 months, miss, except Sir Roderick, and Sir Roderick is not asking. Sir Roderick is taking. Sir Roderick, but Mrs. Bramwell had turned to the dresser, where the keys of the house lay in 2 iron rings, and was unhooking them with brisk small clinks. Never mind, there is the still room, there is the linen press, there is the silver, there is the cellar. You shall not have that key until his Grace gives it to you with his own hand, which is how it is done in this house. Come. Hephzibah set the cup down. She followed. By 11 o'clock the carpenter had come up the drive in his cart with a boy and a crowbar. By 1:30, the first nail screamed out of the soft old oak of the morning-room shutter and fell into the gravel with a small dead sound. By noon the shutter swung open upon hinges stiff with rust, and a flat gray light, the first to enter that room in 2 years and 4 months, fell upon a chair drawn up to a writing table, a work-basket, and a small porcelain cup with a dried smear of chocolate at the bottom. No one had touched any of it. Hephzibah stood in the doorway with the ring of keys cold against her hip and did not go in. Behind her, in the corridor, the strike and drag of the Duke's boot stopped at her shoulder. He did not enter the room either. He looked over her head at the chair, and at the cup, and at the work-basket with a half-finished length of cream-colored tatting still pinned to its cushion. Air it, he said quietly. Cover the cup. Do not move the basket. Yes, Your Grace. He stood a moment longer. Then he turned and went away down the corridor, and she heard him on the great stairs, slower than usual, the cane setting down hard on every other tread. That afternoon Mr. Reuben Ashworth came into the housekeeper's room with his ledger under his arm, his felt hat in his hand, and the mud of the home farm on the cuffs of his brown coat. He was a square man of 48, with a face the color of saddle leather and hands so calloused that the quills seemed a small bone in them. He had been steward of Rushmere 31 years. He had begun as a stable boy. Mrs. Sackville, he inclined his head, I am to set you the accounts of the house. His Grace has signed the order, Mr. Ashworth. The keys are in your hand. The carpenter is paid. The orangery glass will be re-leaded after Easter. I have written to a man at Burton-on-Trent. He laid the ledger on the table and opened it to a page ruled in his own neat hand. And I am to say a thing to you, miss, which his Grace did not say himself, and which he would not thank me for saying. So I shall say it once, and I shall not say it again. She waited, her hands folded. Mr. Ashworth lowered his voice. The big calloused hand rested flat upon the open ledger. There is a gentleman in London who has been writing to this house for 4 months, asking after a young woman of the name of Sackville, daughter of the late Reverend Theodore Sackville of Abbots Bromley. His letters have not been answered. They have been laid before his Grace, and his Grace has not yet replied to them, because his Grace does not know what to reply. The gentleman calls himself Sir Roderick Courtenay. He is a solicitor of the King's Bench. He says he is your guardian in Chancery, and he says there is a matter of property attaching to your name. Hephzibah went very still. The candle on the dresser, lit early against the grey afternoon, threw a small flame upward and was reflected once in the dark of her eyes. Property, Mr. Ashworth. Property, miss. I do not know its size. I do not know its kind. But I will tell you this. A man who writes 4 letters in 4 months and is not answered is a man who is about to come in person. He closed the ledger. He took up his hat. His Grace has set Mrs. Bramwell to listen at the door for the bell. He has set me to ride to Lichfield tomorrow, on business that is not Lichfield's. He has done these things without telling you, miss, because he thought you had grief enough to carry without a London solicitor laid on top of it. I think he was wrong. I think you carry better than he supposes. He bowed. He went out. Hephzibah stood a long moment in the small room with the ledger closed before her and the ring of keys cold against her hip. From the corridor beyond, faint and uneven, came the strike and drag of a boot upon stone, going away towards the west wing, where a shutter had been opened that day for the first time in 2 years and 4 months, and where a chair waited at a writing table that no one had been permitted to touch. She crossed quietly to the window. She drew the curtain a little aside. Down upon the gravel of the carriage sweep, a black traveling chaise, with no crest upon the door, was just turning in at the lodge gates, its lamps already lit against the failing afternoon. She let the curtain fall. 3 weeks after that rainy night, the library at Rushmere Hall smelled of cold ash and old leather. Hephzibah crossed the marble threshold with a ring of new keys at her waist, a cloth folded over her arm, and a list of every shelf the late Duchess had loved. Lucius stood at the long window, back to the door, one hand braced on the sill, the other curled around the silver lion of his cane. He did not turn when she entered. He only said, without looking, "You move quietly, Mrs. Sackville. I prefer to be warned. I shall stamp upon the boards in future, Your Grace." The smallest twitch passed along the line of his shoulders. It was the closest thing to a smile she had yet drawn from him. She set the cloth upon the reading table. The library had not been dusted in 3 winters. Brown rectangles marked where books had been pulled and never replaced. A spider's web stretched in a perfect gray sail between 2 volumes of Tacitus. She began at the lowest shelf, her sleeves already pinned back to the elbow. He turned then. The light caught the cane, the polished black of his coat, the small white scar that cut his left brow in half. "My mother kept her favorites here," he said. "Italian poets, a Petrarch in red morocco. I have not been able to find it since I came home. I shall look while I clean, Your Grace." "Do." He did not leave. He took the great chair by the fire, stretched the bad leg with care, and watched her work as though she were a problem of geometry he had not yet solved. She climbed the rolling ladder. She wiped, she sat down, she took up, she wiped again. The dust rose in slow gold ribbons through the morning light. On the 3rd shelf, behind a hollowed-out copy of Fordyce's sermons that no one in Rushmere Hall had ever opened with sincerity, her cloth caught upon a corner of stiff vellum. She drew the book out. Behind it, wedged flat against the paneling, lay a slim packet of letters tied in black ribbon, and beneath that, a single folded sheet, sealed in red wax. The seal was not the Heathcote lion. It bore a smaller device, a knot of corded rope. She climbed down with the packet in one hand and the loose letter in the other. She would not have opened a sealed paper. She did not need to. The direction in faded brown ink was perfectly clear. To the Lady Hephzibah Sackville, in trust, on the day of her majority. Her own name, Lady. A title she had never worn in her life. She set the letters upon the reading table beside the cloth and stood very still. The Duke had been looking at the fire. Something in the change of her breath turned his head. "Mrs. Sackville? There is a letter here, Your Grace, addressed to me." He rose, slowly because of the knee, and crossed the carpet. He took the folded paper from her without asking. She let him. The seal was unbroken. He turned it once between his fingers, and his face, which she had thought already still, became stiller. "This is my mother's hand on the outside," he said quietly. "She wrote your name, in the year before she died. I never met her, Your Grace." "No, but she knew you existed." He carried the letter to the window. She did not follow. She unwound the black ribbon from the packet upon the table, because her hands required something to do, and the topmost paper opened of its own accord. It was a copy in a clerk's neat round hand of a deed of trust. The names upon it walked up to meet her like figures from a dream she had been having all her life without remembering. Sackville, her father, her grandfather, her mother's maiden name, a sum, £12,000 per annum, secured upon the lands at Ravenhurst in the county of Suffolk, the rents thereof to be received by her on the day of her marriage or on the day of her 30th year, whichever should sooner come, held in the meantime in trust by the Court of Chancery. Guardian appointed by the late Mr. Sackville and confirmed by the court, Sir Roderick Courtenay, of Lincoln's Inn. She read it twice. The second time her fingertips went cold. She had buried her father in a wool gown turned twice and a borrowed bonnet. She had sold his watch to pay the surgeon. She had walked from Ipswich to Staffordshire because the post was beyond her means. For 3 years she had eaten what a costumier's apprentice eats, which is bread and small beer and other women's leavings. £12,000 a year. A small dry sound came out of her throat. It was not laughter. It was the sound a person makes when the wall they have been pushing against for 3 years suddenly is not there. Mrs. Sackville. She had not heard him approach. The Duke stood at her shoulder, the broken seal of his mother's letter now hanging open in his left hand. His gray eyes moved from her face to the deed upon the table and back again. "Sit down." "I do not wish to sit, Your Grace." "Sit down. You have gone the color of paper." He set a hand at her elbow, with the impersonal courtesy of a soldier helping a wounded man, and he placed her in the great chair beside the fire. He took the deed from her fingers. He read it. The line between his brows deepened. "You knew nothing of this." "No, Your Grace. Your father is named here as a baronet of Suffolk. My father was a clerk in a shipping house in Ipswich. He died of a fever 3 years past. We had nothing. You had this." He tapped the paper. "Held against you in Chancery, by Sir Roderick Courtenay. I do not know the gentleman. He is your mother's cousin by what I read. He has been your guardian since you were 9 years of age." He paused. The next words came with the same flat precision he had used at Waterloo to give orders no man wished to hear. "And he has never written to you?" "No." "Nor sent you a shilling of these moneys?" "No." He set the deed aside. He took up his mother's letter from where he had laid it upon the chimney-piece. He did not give it to her. He read it aloud instead, in his low, even voice, because he had judged in 3 seconds that she would steady more quickly to a man's voice than to a dead woman's hand. The letter was short. The late Duchess of Rushmere wrote that in the spring of 1808 she had met at Bath a Mrs. Sackville of Ipswich, who was a baronet's wife in all but the public use of her style, her husband having quarrelled with his father and put off the title in disgust. She wrote that Mrs. Sackville had spoken at length of her daughter Hepzibah, 4 years old, grave and quiet, who already sewed her own samplers. She wrote that Mr. Sackville had told her, in confidence, that the family settlement upon his daughter was to be held in Chancery, and that he distrusted the cousin who was guardian. She wrote, in the last paragraph, that if ever a Sackville girl came to need shelter, the house of Rushmere stood open in memory of an old kindness. The Duchess had died of a winter cough 6 months later. The letter had been sealed and put behind a sermon book that no one would open, and forgotten. Lucius folded the page along its old creases. He did not look at her while he spoke. "My mother kept her promises through the paneling of a library. It is the manner of women of her generation. They did not trust paper that lived in drawers. Your Grace, you will not call me that for a moment. I am thinking." She watched him think. He stood with the letter between 2 fingers and the cane planted before him and the bad knee taking the smaller share of his weight, and she saw, for the first time since she had crossed his threshold, the officer who had held a square against cavalry. The room rearranged itself around the stillness of him. "Sir Roderick Courtenay," he said at last. "I know the name. He keeps chambers in Lincoln's Inn near the Old Hall. He is a solicitor of the King's Bench, and a man of small fortune publicly, and, I have always understood, of large fortune privately. He is also, by reputation, a careful man. Careful men who become rich on a clerk's salary are, in my experience, drawing the difference from someone else's purse. He is drawing it from mine. Yes." The single syllable landed in the quiet between them, like a coin upon a counter. She was no longer cold. She set both hands flat upon her knees and looked at the fire and made the small private accounting that women of her station learned to make before they were 12. 3 years of bread and small beer, a father buried in a parish coat, a walk from Ipswich, the bell at the gate, the rain, the ribbon at her wrist, £12,000 a year, eaten by a stranger in oak chambers, while she had sat upon her heels and remended his coats for 6 pence. "I should like, Your Grace, to write to this gentleman. You will not. I am of age. I have a right. You have a right, and you have a guardian who has spent 9 years burying that right. If you write to him today, by the end of the week the documents in his chambers will be in the fire, and 3 new ones, equally signed and witnessed, will be in his strong box saying you owe him money. I know the breed. I have prosecuted the breed for tenants of mine. Then what is to be done? He did not answer at once. He looked at the deed upon the table, and at the letters in the packet, and at the cold ash of the grate that no one had cleared since the late Duchess had last sat in this room, and a private calculation moved behind his face. Mr. Ashworth will go to London tomorrow, quietly. He will inquire among the clerks of the King's Bench what moneys have been drawn upon the Sackville Trust in the past 9 years, and into whose accounts they have gone. He will not give your name, he will give mine. Sir Roderick will hear that the Duke of Rushmere is making inquiries, and he will assume the cause is some matter of tenancy in Suffolk. He will not assume the cause is you. That is the time we have. And when he ceases to assume, the gray eyes lifted at last to her face. They were not soft. They were not unkind. They were the eyes of a man taking the measure of a fortified wall. Then you will be in a position from which he cannot move you. I do not understand. You will, he said. I am thinking how to put it without dishonoring you. Give me until tomorrow. He bowed. It was the bow of a man at court, not the small inclination of a master to a servant, and it was so out of place in that dusty room that she rose half from the chair before she remembered to sit again. He went to the door. He stopped there with the cane braced against the jamb. Mrs. Sackville, your grace, you are not to clean this library again. You are not to climb a ladder in this house. From this hour, the work of your hands belongs to no one but yourself. Mrs. Bramwell will be informed. That is not necessary. It is entirely necessary. I have, by the carelessness of my own household, employed a baronet's daughter as a maid of all work, and I shall not compound the offense by another mourning. I came to you for shelter, your grace, not for rank. I know it. That is why I shall give you both. He paused. The line of his mouth moved very slightly. You will continue, however, as governess of this house. Your wages will be doubled and paid out of my private purse, not the estate. The west wing will be opened as agreed. Mr. Ashworth leaves at first light. Good day. He was gone before she could answer. The door closed upon a small wash of cold air from the hall, and the dust she had raised settled slowly back upon the shelves. She sat in the great chair for a long time. The deed lay upon the table. The black ribbon lay beside it. The late Duchess's letter lay folded upon the chimney-piece where he had set it down. She did not weep. She had not wept when her father died, and she did not weep now. She thought, very slowly, of a small dark room over a chandler's shop in Ipswich, and of a winter when she had eaten cabbage water for 9 days, and of a man in oak chambers in Lincoln's Inn, whose name until that morning she had not known. The fire had gone out. She rose, knelt upon the hearth, and built it up again with her own hands because the habit of 3 years did not unmake itself in a quarter of an hour. The kindling caught. A small clean flame stood up in the grate. She watched it a moment. Then she gathered the deed, the packet of letters, and the late Duchess's note, and carried them across the library to the great writing desk in the corner. She locked them in the lowest drawer. She put the key on the ring at her waist, beside the keys of the linen press and the still room and the doors of the west wing. When Mrs. Bramwell came at noon with a tray of bread and cold meat, she found the new governess at the long window, her hands folded before her, her gray skirt very still, looking out over the lawn where the rooks were rising and falling above the elms. Bless me, child, you have not eaten. I shall presently, Mrs. Bramwell, thank you. His Grace is gone to the South Meadow with Mr. Ashworth. They have been an hour at the table in the steward's room, with the door shut. There is a great writing of papers going forward. Yes. Is anything amiss, my dear? Hephzibah turned from the window. The cook saw her face and set the tray down quickly and did not ask again. Nothing is amiss, Mrs. Bramwell. A matter has been discovered that needs a little attention. His Grace has been very kind. His Grace is always kind to them, as does not expect it. Yes, said Hephzibah. I am beginning to learn that. She ate the bread because Mrs. Bramwell would not leave until she did, and she drank the small beer, and she thanked the cook, and when she was alone again she went to the chimney-piece and took down the late Duchess's letter. She did not read it. She held it a moment against the place beneath her collar where the black mourning ribbon had been tied for 3 years at her wrist, and was now, for the first time that morning, untied. Above stairs in the long gallery, Lucius stood at his mother's portrait. He had been there a quarter of an hour. The painted Duchess looked back at him with the same gray eyes he saw in his shaving glass. He did not speak to the portrait. He had outgrown that in Spain. He only stood, and at last he said, half aloud, to no one, "It seems you have left me a wife, madam. I shall endeavor not to disgrace your choice." Down in the steward's room, Mr. Ashworth was already strapping his valise. Mr. Ashworth rode through the night and reached Lincoln's Inn before the lamplighters came down their ladders. He sat in a low coffee house across from the chambers of Sir Roderick Courtenay and watched a clerk carry out a leather satchel bound in red tape. He noted the hour. He noted the clerk's face. He rode back to Staffordshire by a different road. At Rushmere Hall, the morning was already at work without him. Hephzibah stood in the linen room, with the keys cold against her wrist. Mrs. Bramwell had handed them over without ceremony 2 days before, and the iron ring still felt borrowed. She counted sheets aloud: 22 damasks, 11 Holland, 4 sets edged in blackwork that had belonged to the late Duchess and had not been aired since the funeral. "They smell of cedar still," she said. "They smell of waiting," Mrs. Bramwell said. Hephzibah set the last sheet onto the pile. "Then we shall stop making them wait." She opened the western shutter of the linen room with her own hand. The light fell on her plain biscuit sleeve and on the black mourning ribbon at her wrist. The ribbon looked, for the first time, like a thing she had chosen to keep. In the library, Lucius was reading a letter he had read 4 times already. It was from a barrister in Holborn whom Ashworth had recommended in a hurried note pushed under his door at dawn. The barrister used the word chancery twice and the word prudence 3 times. He did not use the word marriage at all. Lucius folded the letter into the volume of Tacitus on the table and limped to the window. His knee was poor today. He saw her crossing the yard below with a basket of camphor and a small pair of shears. She did not look up. She did not need to. He watched her go until she rounded the corner of the stable, and then he turned from the window and rang for his valet. "The black coat," he said, "and send to the chapel for Reverend Withers. Tell him I shall require him at 3 o'clock, and that he is to bring his register and to mention this errand to no one." The valet, who had been with him at Vittoria and at Toulouse, did not ask why. He bowed and went. By 2:30, the news had crossed the kitchen on the wings of Mrs. Bramwell's apron strings, although Mrs. Bramwell had said nothing. The housemaids felt it before they were told. Sukey dropped a polishing cloth in the gallery and did not pick it up. There was no announcement. The house simply tilted. Hephzibah came in from the yard with the basket on her arm and was met in the side passage by Lady Augusta Goring. Lady Augusta had arrived an hour before in a traveling carriage with 2 outriders and a maid she did not need. She wore the lilac-gray morning gown and the paisley shawl, and she carried her ivory fan closed in her right hand like a magistrate's gavel. She looked Hephzibah up and down once, slowly, the way she might have looked over a horse at Tattersall's, and then she opened the fan. "My dear," she said, "you are about to be married. Set down the basket." Hephzibah set down the basket. She did not pretend not to understand. She had heard the ring at the front door, and the boy run to the stable, and the second boy run to the chapel, and she had counted the steps the way a seamstress counts stitches. "His Grace has not spoken to me," she said. "He will speak to you in the chapel, where there is a witness," said Lady Augusta. "He is not a coward, but he is a Heathcote, and Heathcotes do not court. They decide. Come." She did not take Hephzibah's arm. She walked beside her, the way one walks beside a bride one is willing to vouch for, and they went up the back stairs together. In the late Duchess's dressing room, which Hephzibah had aired only the week before, sash by sash, Lady Augusta opened a press and lifted out a gown of slate-gray silk with long sleeves and a high collar of black lace. It was a half-mourning gown. It had been made 11 years ago, and it had never been worn. "It will fit," Lady Augusta said. "Her Grace was your height. She had your shoulders. She would have liked you to have it for this hour. She would not have liked you in biscuit cotton in her chapel." Hephzibah touched the lace at the collar. Her hand was steady. "I have nothing to give him," she said. "You have your word," said Lady Augusta. "That is what one gives. Lift your arms." Hephzibah lifted her arms. The biscuit gown came off. The slate silk came on. Lady Augusta fastened the 11 small jet buttons at the back, without speaking. And at the 8th button she paused and said, very low, "Child, if he has done this in haste because of money, you must still say yes. Do you understand me? I understand you. And if he has done it because he is afraid he will not be brave enough later, you must still say yes. I understand you. Then we shall not speak of it again. Turn round." She turned. Lady Augusta looked at her for a long, quiet moment and then nodded once, sharp, and gave her a sprig of rosemary from a small silver box. "For remembrance," she said. "It is what my mother gave me. It is older than orange blossom and it costs nothing. Put it at your waist." Hephzibah put it at her waist. The chapel of Rushmere Hall stood at the edge of the park, beyond the yew walk, a small square Norman thing with a low door and 3 narrow windows of old greenish glass. Reverend Withers had lit 4 candles on the altar, and 1 at the lectern. Mr. Ashworth had returned from his ride less than an hour before. He had not changed his boots. He stood by the south wall with his hat in both hands and a small leather book pressed against his chest. Mrs. Bramwell, in her best black gown and a fresh white cap, stood opposite him. Lady Augusta took the front pew on the right. Lucius was already at the altar when Hephzibah came in. He had set the ebony cane against the rail. He did not lean on it. He turned when he heard the door, and when he saw her in the slate silk with the rosemary at her waist, something in his face moved that he did not allow to reach his mouth. He waited for her to walk the length of the aisle. It was 11 paces. She took them at her own speed. The mourning ribbon was still on her wrist. She had not taken it off. At the rail he said, low, before the Reverend could begin, "I should have asked you in a parlor. I have not done this elegantly." "You have done it honestly," she said. "Have I?" She looked at him. Her dark eyes were very calm. "If you have not, I shall know by Michaelmas." He almost smiled. He did not. Reverend Withers opened the book. The service was short. The Reverend used the old words, and Lucius answered in a voice that had given orders at Quatre Bras and did not shake now. When the question came to her, Hephzibah said, "I will," without hesitation and without flourish, the way she had said yes to mending the shirt by the single candle, the way she said yes to work she meant to finish. He had no ring of his own to give her. There had been no time, and so he drew from his smallest finger the gold signet with the Heathcote arms, the heron on the lion's shoulder, and slid it onto her thumb, where it sat heavy and warm. It was too large. She closed her hand around it so it would not fall. "With this ring I thee wed," he said. "With my body I thee honor. With all my worldly goods I thee endow." The 4th candle guttered. Mrs. Bramwell's mouth moved silently with the words. Mr. Ashworth, who had not wept at his own mother's funeral, blinked once, hard. It was done in less than a quarter of an hour. They signed the register at the lectern. Hephzibah Sackville, Lucius Augustus Heathcote, Augusta Goring, witness. Reuben Ashworth, witness. The ink dried in the cold. Reverend Withers blotted it with a square of fawn flannel and closed the book. There was no breakfast. There were no bells. Lady Augusta kissed Hephzibah once on the cheek and said, "Welcome to the family, Duchess," in a voice that carried only as far as the pew, and walked out without looking behind her. Mrs. Bramwell curtsied, a deeper curtsy than she had given any mistress in 29 years, and Mr. Ashworth bowed. Lucius offered Hephzibah his arm. She took it. They walked back through the yew walk in silence. The path was narrow. His bad knee struck the gravel at every other step. She did not slow. She did not hurry. At the door of the hall he paused with his hand on the iron latch. "Your Grace," he said, and the title came out of him as if he were trying it for the first time and finding it heavier than expected. "Your Grace," she said back, in the same tone, and she did not flinch from it. He opened the door for her, and she went in. That evening, they dined alone in the small breakfast room. The great dining room was closed under Holland covers, and neither of them wished to walk into a 40-foot silence on their wedding night. Mrs. Bramwell sent up a clear soup, a saddle of mutton, and a syllabub, and lit 2 best wax candles herself. Hephzibah had changed out of the slate silk. She was in a simple gray wool that had been the late Duchess's morning dress, taken in at the waist by her own hand that afternoon in 20 minutes flat. The signet ring was now on a length of black ribbon round her neck, where it would not slide off her thumb when she worked. She had not removed the mourning band from her wrist. Lucius noticed all of this without remarking on any of it. They ate slowly. They spoke of the gutters of the west wing. They spoke of Mr. Ashworth's plan to drain the lower meadow before Michaelmas. They spoke of a tenant in the village whose roof had failed in the March storm and whose wife was lying in. They did not speak of London. They did not speak of money. They did not speak of his mother. When the syllabub was taken away, he set down his glass. "There are matters," he said, "that I shall have to lay before you. Not tonight, tomorrow, in the library, at 11 o'clock, if it suits you." "It suits me. They are not pleasant matters." "I had not supposed they would be." He looked at her then for a long moment across the 2 candles. "Hephzibah," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name without her title in front of it. "I have not deceived you. I shall not deceive you. But I have not told you everything. and I shall not tell you everything tonight. I am asking you to wait until 11 o'clock tomorrow." She thought about that. She turned the signet on its ribbon once between her fingers. "You have until 11 o'clock," she said. He bowed his head a fraction. "Thank you." She rose. He rose with her, slower, his hand finding the back of the chair for balance. At the door of the breakfast room, she stopped and turned. "Lucius," she said, and the name in her mouth surprised him, though his face did not show it. "The housekeeper's room is at the foot of the back stair. I have not moved my things. I shall not move them tonight. I had not asked you to." "No, you had not. I wished to say it before you did not ask." She went out. He stood by the chair a moment longer, his hand still on its back, and then he sat down again and finished his wine, slowly, alone, with the two best wax candles burning between him and the empty plate where she had been. Upstairs, in the housekeeper's room at the foot of the back stair, Hephzibah set the signet ring on the small deal table by the bed and the sprig of rosemary beside it. She brushed her hair out in 50 long strokes, counting, because counting steadied her. Then she looked at her own face in the small square glass on the wall. "Duchess of Rushmere," she said aloud, very quietly to see how it sounded. It sounded like a dress someone else had made, that would have to be taken in at the waist before she could wear it. She blew out the candle. 3 days passed. She did not wait for him to ask. By the morning after the wedding, she had moved the linen accounts and the still-room ledger into a small writing desk in the morning room and set herself up there at 8 o'clock each day. By the second morning, the under-housekeeper of 20 years' standing was reporting to her without resentment, because Hephzibah asked questions no one had asked in 11 years. By the third morning, 22 windows nailed shut since the late Duchess's death had been opened, scraped, and washed. The house began to smell of beeswax and turpentine and cut grass instead of camphor and damp. Mrs. Bramwell, who had wept exactly twice in her life and never in public, was caught by Sukey in the still room with her apron pressed to her mouth, and chased the girl out with a wooden spoon. Lucius watched all of this. He did not interfere. He had ridden to the home farm at dawn each day with Ashworth, and come back at dusk with mud to his stirrup. They met at dinner. They spoke of the estate. He addressed her as Your Grace before the servants, and as Hephzibah alone. She addressed him as Your Grace before the servants, and, when alone, as nothing at all yet. She had not found the name for him in private. He did not press her for it. On the third night, he came to the door of the small parlor where she was mending, out of habit. She had said she would not give up her needle, and he had not asked her to, and he stood in the doorway with his shoulder against the jamb. "You have not asked me what I had to say at 11 o'clock on the morning after our wedding," he said. "No, why not?" She did not look up from the seam. "Because you were going to tell me. And then the tenant's roof failed, and you rode out. And then it was the third day, and I thought, he will tell me when he is ready. Either way, I shall know." He came into the room. He sat down opposite her, his bad knee straight out in front of him, his hands loose on his thighs. The candle was between them. "I am ready," he said. She set down the needle. "There is a sum of money," he said. £12,000 a year. It is yours. It has been yours since your father died. It is held in chancery, and your guardian is a man named Sir Roderick Courtenay, who is your mother's cousin, and who has been drawing on the principal and burying the correspondence for 11 years. I learned of it the day before yesterday in this room, by accident, from a letter my mother wrote and never sent. The legacy is releasable only on your marriage. That is why I asked you in the chapel and not in a parlor. I did not wish you to refuse me out of pride before I could explain it. I have explained it badly. I am explaining it now." She looked at the candle. She did not look at him. 12,000 a year," she said. "Yes. And you knew this before the chapel." "I knew this before the chapel." "And you did not say." "I did not say." The clock on the mantel struck the quarter. Somewhere in the yard a dog barked once and was quiet. "Why," she said, "did you not say?" He was silent a long moment. Then he said, "Because I was afraid that if you knew, you would marry me for the legacy, and I would never again be certain whether you had married me for any other reason. It was a vanity. It was a piece of pride that does not become a man of my age. I am not proud of it. I am telling you now because I would rather be the man who told you than the man who did not." She picked up the needle again. She put it down again. She lifted the signet on its black ribbon from her collarbone and let it fall back. "Lucius," she said, and this time the name was not a test. "I should have married you for the roof of the western wing and the chapel and Mrs. Bramwell's syllabub. I did not need £12,000 to do it, but I should have liked to be told. I should have liked very much to be told. I know. You will not do it again. I will not do it again. Then we shall not speak of it tonight. Tomorrow you will write to your barrister in Holborn, and to Sir Roderick, and we shall see what kind of man my mother's cousin is. I have written to the barrister. I have not written to Sir Roderick. Good, she said. Do not write to him yet. Let him come to us. He will. Men of that sort always come, when they hear of a wedding they did not expect. She picked up the needle a third time, and this time she set the stitch. He watched her hands a moment, and then he rose, slow against his knee, and went to the door. There he turned. Your Grace, he said. Your Grace, she answered. Without looking up, he went out. She finished the seam. The mourning ribbon on her wrist caught the candlelight once, and then she snipped the thread, and the sound was very small and very final in the quiet room. In Lincoln's Inn that same hour, by a coal fire that had been allowed to burn low, Sir Roderick Courtenay was reading a short note brought up from the porter's lodge. It had come by a private rider out of Staffordshire. It bore no seal he recognized. It contained 2 lines in a clerk's hand. His Grace the Duke of Rushmere was married on Tuesday last to Miss Hepzibah Sackville of this parish. Felicitations are in order. He read it twice. He took off his spectacles and laid them on the desk, and the ink stain on his hand caught the firelight. Then he opened the lowest drawer, took out a ledger bound in red calf, and began, without hurry, to alter a date. The carriage came to a halt before Belvoir House on a warm June evening, and Hepzibah stepped down without waiting for Lucius to circle round. Mayfair smelled of lamp oil and horses and the cut grass of the square. Footmen in green livery lined the steps. Lanterns burned in every window. From the open doors drifted violins and the low roar of 200 voices in conversation, that particular London sound that resembled water moving over stones. She had been in town 9 days. Already she had learned its weather. Lucius offered his arm. He had set aside the cane for the evening, though she felt the small hesitation in his step as they crossed the threshold. The careful way he placed his right foot upon the marble. His face revealed nothing. He had spent the carriage ride telling her the names of the hostess's 3 daughters and 1 nephew, and not one word about the morning's letter from Ashworth. She had read it over his shoulder. He had not stopped her. Lady Belvoir received them in the long gallery beneath a portrait of her late husband. She was a tall woman with a hard mouth softened by professional warmth, and she greeted the Duke of Rushmere as though his absence from London these past 6 years had been a personal grief. Her eyes moved across Hepzibah with the practiced speed of a woman pricing silk. Your Grace, she said, and the new Duchess. We have heard so very much. Then you have heard more than I have said, Lucius answered, and bowed her hand to his lips. Lady Belvoir laughed. It was the laugh of a woman who had already decided the evening's verdict. They moved into the ballroom. The crowd parted and reformed with the slow indifference of a river round a stone. Hepzibah felt the eyes upon her as a physical pressure, beginning at her shoulders and traveling down her spine. Her gown was new, white sarcenet over a slip of pale rose, a single string of pearls at her throat. The fan Lady Augusta had pressed into her hand at the door. None of it disguised her. She knew this. She had not tried. She looked, deliberately, at the chandelier. Lucius noted the angle of her chin and felt a small, sharp pride that surprised him. Lady Augusta was already waiting by the 3rd pillar, planted there like a friendly garrison. The paisley shawl was the same. The granite rings were the same. She squeezed Hepzibah's wrist with the unfussy strength of a woman who had decided, months ago, what side she was on. Stand here, Augusta said quietly. Smile at no one in particular. Let them come to you. And if they do not come, then we have learned something useful before supper. They came. Some quickly, some after the 3rd circuit of the room. A dowager with a turban of bronze gauze. A young baronet who could not look at her face, and so looked at her shoulder. The Bishop of Carlisle, who blessed her with 2 fingers and a faint odor of port. Each conversation lasted the exact same length, 4 exchanges and a curtsy, as though the ton had agreed upon a metronome before her arrival. Lucius stood 3 paces away and did not interfere. He had a glass of hock in his hand and had not drunk from it. The musicians struck up the first set. He led her out for the opening minuet, and for the length of that dance the room remembered its manners. She did not stumble. She had practiced for 3 weeks in the long gallery at Rushmere, with Mrs. Bramwell humming the line, and Ashworth marking the floor with chalk. The chalk had worn through her slippers. She danced now as though the chalk were still beneath her feet. When the figure returned them to the head of the line, Lucius said, very low, "You are doing better than I did at my first London ball. You were a child. I was 21. Then you were a child." He almost smiled. 3 women near the pillar saw it and looked at one another. The set ended. He brought her to the side of the room and asked if she wished for lemonade. She said yes because she wished him to walk away for 2 minutes so that she might steady her breathing without an audience. He understood this and went. That was when Lady Cordelia Beaulieu appeared. She had been waiting, Hepzibah realized. She had been waiting for the precise moment the Duke's back was turned, and the circle of safe conversation had thinned. The jonquil silk of her gown was so yellow, it seemed to give off its own light. Her tiara caught the chandeliers and threw small stars upon the wall behind her. 12 people stood within earshot. A marchioness, 2 colonels, the wife of a cabinet minister, a clutch of debutantes still loyal to last season's queen. Cordelia had chosen her audience the way a general chooses ground. "Your Grace," she said, and curtsied very low. "How perfectly charming you look. So fresh, so unaffected. One would never guess." Hepzibah inclined her head, the precise depth that protocol demanded, and not a hair lower. "Lady Cordelia, you must tell us how you keep your figure so neat. I am told country governesses live entirely upon bread and milk. Is it true?" A small silence. A debutante giggled and was hushed. "I have never been a governess," Hepzibah said. The word was mild. She did not raise her voice. "Oh, forgive me. Housekeeper, was it? I confess I find the terms so very alike." Cordelia opened her painted fan. The mythological scenes turned slowly between her gloved fingers. How fortunate for the Duke that his linens were in such want of mending. Some men, I am told, mistake gratitude for affection. It is the saddest of confusions. The Marchioness behind her smiled into her glass. "And the saddest of confusions in turn," Cordelia continued, "is when a woman of no name takes that affection for an offer." Hepzibah felt the blood leave her hands. She did not look down. She did not look for Lucius. She looked at Cordelia's mouth, at the small dry crack in the carmine on her lower lip, and she said nothing at all. It was the silence that did the damage. The ton read it as confession. A laugh rose, small at first, from the second colonel. The debutantes took it up because debutantes always do. The Marchioness allowed herself a single low sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a cough. Within 4 seconds, the laughter had run the length of the pillar and reached the doorway. 20 people, then 40. A sound like a flock of starlings rising at once from a single field. Hepzibah stood inside it. The chandelier above her did not move. The musicians, sensing what they did not see, glided into a softer air. Lady Augusta arrived at her elbow with 2 glasses of lemonade and the placid face of a woman who had decided to murder no one before midnight. "My dear," she said clearly, so that the nearest 12 heard, "do come and tell Lady Sefton about your scheme for the cottage hospital. She is most particularly interested." She did not look at Cordelia at all. The cut was so clean it left no blood on the floor. They walked. Hepzibah walked because Augusta's hand at her wrist required it. The laughter behind her did not stop. It dimmed, as such laughter always dims, into the more dangerous thing, the murmured retelling. Lucius returned with the lemonade Lady Sefton had not requested. He read the room in one glance. He read his wife's face in less. Something passed across his eyes that was not quite anger. It was older than anger. He did not cross to Cordelia. He did not raise his voice. He bowed to Lady Sefton, made one quiet remark about her late husband's library at Strathfield Say, and within a quarter of an hour, the ton's metronome had altered by a single beat. Lady Sefton, whose voucher to Almack's was worth a small estate, kept the new Duchess at her side for 3 full circuits of the room. It was not a rescue. It was a verdict in a smaller court. Cordelia watched from the pillar with her fan held very still. A young man at her shoulder, a cousin in the blues with hair pomaded to a hard gloss, whispered something into her ear. She did not answer him. Her gloved hand tightened upon the ivory sticks of the fan until one of them creaked audibly. The cousin stepped back half a pace and did not whisper again. Across the room, beside the second window, the Bishop of Carlisle was already revising his earlier blessing. He spoke into the ear of his neighbor, a widow with 3 unmarried daughters, and the widow's eyes traveled the length of the room and rested upon Hepzibah, and made a small calculation of their own. By the end of the evening, that calculation would be repeated in 11 drawing rooms. The ton did not condemn quickly. It catalogued. At the supper hour, Lucius brought Hepzibah, to a small table near a window that had been opened against the heat. He set down her plate. He set down his own. He looked at her across the white linen and said, "I am sorry." "For what?" "For not arriving sooner. You arrived precisely when you meant to." He absorbed this. He did not deny it. He picked up his fork and did not eat. After a moment he said, "There is something I must tell you." She waited. "It can wait until we are home. Tell me now." He glanced at the open window, at the candle between them, at the small silver dish of salt. He shook his head once. "Not here." She lowered her eyes to the plate. She did not press him. She had learned in 9 days of London that a wife who pressed her husband across a public table furnished the next morning's gossip column. But something inside her closed by half a turn, the way a lock closes when the key has been removed too soon. The supper passed, the dancing resumed. She danced once with Lord Belvoir and once with an elderly viscount who wished to speak of his late wife's roses. She did not dance again with Lucius. She did not seek him with her eyes. He stayed within 10 paces of her all the same. They left at 2. The carriage swayed through Berkeley Square. Neither spoke. The lamps along Piccadilly painted his profile in long passes of gold and dark. Once his hand crossed the seat and rested upon hers, and she did not withdraw it. But she did not turn her palm beneath his either. He noted this. He set his hand back upon his own knee. The next morning, the first calls were declined. The cards came up to her dressing room in a smaller pile. Lady Belvoir regretted that she was indisposed. The Marchioness of Stanhope had unexpectedly removed to Richmond. The wife of the cabinet minister sent her compliments and no date. Augusta arrived at noon and read the silver salver in one glance. "It will pass," she said briskly, and did not believe it. And Hephzibah did not require her to. By Friday, 3 of these will have changed their minds. By Monday, 2 of those 3 will have remembered that they wish to be invited to Rushmere for the shooting. The ton is a coward, my dear. It will not bite a duchess for long. It bit last night. It bit a woman it did not yet know was a duchess. There is a difference. She did not explain the difference. Hephzibah, watching her over the rim of the chocolate cup, understood that Augusta meant something she did not yet wish to say aloud. Lucius was not at breakfast. He had gone out, the footman said, very early, to call upon Mr. Ashworth at the chambers Ashworth had taken in Lincoln's Inn for the duration of the season. He had taken no carriage. He had walked. It was 4 mornings later that the note arrived. The silver salver came up to her dressing room at 9:30 with the morning's correspondence, 3 cards of invitation, a bill from the Glover, and 1 folded sheet sealed with a plain wafer of unmarked gray wax. No frank, no direction beyond her grace. By hand, she broke the wafer with her thumbnail. The hand inside was disguised, large round letters that leaned in no particular direction, the writing of a person who had practiced before writing. "Madam, your husband's solicitor at Lincoln's Inn has by his own hand received correspondence these 6 weeks past from your guardian in Chancery, one Sir Roderick Courtenay, whose particular interest in your person is matter of public record at the King's Bench. His Grace has not seen fit to inform you. Ask him why the letters are kept in the lowest drawer of his desk under the ledger bound in red calf. A friend." She read it twice. She read it a 3rd time. The paper was cheap. The wafer had been pressed by a thumb that wore no ring. None of it mattered. The words were arranged in the order that did the work. She did not ring for her maid. She did not weep. She walked, in her morning gown of pale lilac muslin, down the back stair and along the corridor to the small library Lucius had taken for his study at Belvoir House. He had ridden out at 8 to call upon his bootmaker. The room smelled of him and of beeswax. She crossed to the desk. The lowest drawer was not locked. The ledger bound in red calf lay on top. Beneath it, tied with a length of black tape, was a bundle of letters. 6. She did not need to read them all. The uppermost was dated the 2nd of May, addressed to His Grace the Duke of Rushmere, signed R. Courtenay, Seoul, King's Bench, in a thin, economical hand. She read the first paragraph, and the last. She read the figures in the middle. 12,000 a year, Sackville Estate, Chancery, marriage. Her own name written 4 times on a single page in a stranger's hand. She set the letters back exactly as she had found them. She retied the black tape with the same knot. She closed the drawer. She walked upstairs without hurry. She sat down at her own writing table by the window that looked over the mews. She did not take up the pen. She placed her hands flat upon the blotter and held them there until they ceased to shake. The clock on the mantel struck 10. She thought of the wedding in the chapel. She thought of his voice saying a marriage of protection. She thought of the way he had not eaten his supper at Belvoir House. She thought of the word protection and of what a man does not tell a woman he means to protect, and she understood, slowly and entirely, that she had been married for 9 weeks to a man who had known, since April, the precise number of pounds her freedom was worth. He had not lied. He had simply allowed her to remain ignorant. In the language of solicitors there was a name for that. In the language of wives there was another. She rose. She went to her dressing room. She took down from the high shelf the small leather case in which she still kept the black mourning ribbon she had worn upon her wrist the night he had first offered her the post of housekeeper. She did not tie it on. She held it in her closed hand. Downstairs a door opened, boots upon the marble, his voice, low, asking the footman whether her grace was at home. She did not answer when the footman came to the door. She stood by the window with the ribbon in her hand and watched. In the long mirror across the room, her own reflection arranged itself into something very still and very upright, the posture of a woman who has just been informed of a death and has not yet decided whom to bury. Below in the hall, Lucius Heathcote, 5th Duke of Rushmere, set down his hat upon the console and asked again, more quietly, whether his wife would receive him. The footman, who had served 3 dukes and read a great many silences, bowed and said he would inquire. The carriage that carried Hephzibah to Hyde Park the next afternoon was the second-best landau, drawn by 2 greys whose harness brasses had been polished until they hurt to look at. Lady Augusta sat opposite her, leaning on the ivory handle of her parasol. The Duke had been called to Whitehall before breakfast and had left only a single line on her tray, written in his sharp, upright hand. "We will not yield the park to them. Wear the rose silk." She wore the rose silk. She also wore her grandmother's pearl drops, because Lady Augusta had set them in her ears with her own ringed fingers and said no more about it. The ring at 5 was a slow river of carriages, bonnets turned, quizzing glasses lifted. A young matron pretended to drop her reticule so she might lean across her husband and stare. Hephzibah kept her gloved hands folded and her chin level. Lady Augusta nodded to those who deserved nodding to, and ignored those who did not, which was a science of its own. At the curve near the Serpentine, the landau slowed behind a barouche, and a thin black figure stepped down off the path with the patience of a man who had been waiting. Sir Roderick Courtenay. He held his hat against his chest with both hands. His brown leather case was tucked beneath his arm, the red ribbon dangling. "Cousin," he said. "A word." Lady Augusta's parasol stopped moving. Hephzibah looked at him over the lacquered side of the carriage. She did not order the driver on. She had decided, somewhere between the gate and the Serpentine, that she would not be a woman whom Sir Roderick could chase. "You have the rest of the park," she said. "Say your word." He stepped closer. Up close his collar was greasy at the throat. The skin under his eyes was the color of old paper. "It would be a kindness," he said, "to your family name, to sign a small instrument of resignation. The guardianship is delicate. There are debts. Your father, may he rest, was not the man the world believed him to be. My father was a quiet man who paid his accounts. There are entries," said Sir Roderick. "There are signatures. There are also," said Lady Augusta in her dry voice, "ears, Sir Roderick, several thousand of them in this park. Choose them carefully." A landau crawled past. 2 faces watched from inside it. Sir Roderick wet his lower lip. "I had hoped," he said, lower, "to be discreet." "You stepped into the public road," said Hephzibah. "You are not being discreet. You are being seen." For one instant, something moved behind his eyes. Not anger. Calculation. He had wanted her flustered, and she was not flustered. He had wanted her alone, and Lady Augusta was sitting beside her in lilac with a parasol that had not blinked. He gathered himself. He bowed. He said, "Then we shall meet, madam, at Mrs. Linden's table tonight." He walked back to the verge. The greys started forward. Lady Augusta tapped Hephzibah's gloved wrist once with the closed leaf of her fan. "That," she said, "was very well done. He came to hunt. He found a wall. Walls bore him. Walls also make him stupid in the evening, which is what we want." Hephzibah's hands, in their gloves, had begun to tremble only now, when no one could see them. "He has a paper," she said. "He has many papers," said Lady Augusta. "Most of them he has written himself." The horses turned out of the gate. She did not tell Lucius about Sir Roderick when she returned. He was not at home. A footman said only that his grace had ridden to the city. The hour for dressing came and went. Her maid laced her into the cream silk with the seed pearl trim that Lady Augusta had chosen for Mrs. Linden's, because Mrs. Linden, as everyone knew, hated cream and would seat any woman in it at the wrong end of the table on purpose. He had not come home by the time Lady Augusta's carriage was called. Hepzibah went down the stairs alone, and the footman who had served 3 dukes met her in the hall, with her cloak across his arm, and said, "His Grace bade me say he will join you at Mrs. Linden's, ma'am. He has gone first to Lincoln's Inn." "Lincoln's Inn," she repeated. "On Mr. Ashworth's business, ma'am. He said you would understand." She did not understand. She nodded as if she did, because the footman was old, and the household watched the mistress for the shape of the evening. She gathered her cloak and went out into the warm July dusk. In the carriage, Lady Augusta said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "He will come. He is not the kind of man who fails to come. He could have told me himself." "Yes," said Lady Augusta, "he could have. That is a separate conversation. We will have it after we have survived dinner." Mrs. Linden's house in Brook Street was lit from top to bottom. The hall smelled of beeswax and forced lilies. Mrs. Linden herself, a tall woman with a thin neck and a great many diamonds at it, came forward with both hands outstretched and the smile of a cat that has placed its mouse beside the cream. "Your Grace," she said, "and dear Lady Augusta, and of course, the new Duchess. We are all so very curious to know you better." The "we" was loud. The drawing-room held 22 guests. Hepzibah saw at once the faces she had been taught to fear. Lady Cordelia Beaulieu, in jonquil silk, her platinum curls high. The Marchioness of Stanhope, who collected scandals as some women collected snuff-boxes. 3 matrons of the Patroness Committee at Almack's, sitting in a row on a sofa as if at a tribunal, and, by the chimney-piece, very upright in the same black coat he had worn that afternoon, Sir Roderick Courtenay, his brown case at his feet, a glass of sherry he was not drinking in his hand. The Duke was not in the room. Mrs. Linden waited a quarter of an hour. She waited it visibly, glancing at the door, lifting her brows for Lady Cordelia to see. Then she said, "I think we shall not stand on ceremony for tardy gentlemen," and gave the order to go in. The table was long. Hepzibah had been placed, as Lady Augusta had predicted, between a deaf admiral and an empty chair. The empty chair was her husband's. It was set with a folded napkin shaped like a swan, and the swan accused her with its silly white head every time she lifted her eyes. The first 2 courses passed. The deaf admiral shouted gently at her about Trafalgar. Lady Cordelia, across and 4 places down, told a story about a country cousin who had worn pattens to a London assembly, and the table laughed in the careful way tables laugh when the joke is meant to land elsewhere. Between the 2nd course and the 3rd, Mrs. Linden rose. She tapped her glass. "Friends," she said, "we have among us tonight a gentleman of the law, Sir Roderick Courtenay, who has begged the indulgence of a single communication. As it touches the honor of this house, I have granted it." Sir Roderick. The footman drew back along the wall. Sir Roderick rose. He took from his case a single sheet of vellum, folded in 3, sealed with a smear of red wax that looked, even from where Hepzibah sat, too fresh. He coughed into his fist. He began. "It is my unhappy duty," he said, "as guardian in chancery to the late Mr. Sackville's only daughter, to lay before this company a matter that affects not only my ward, but the honor of an ancient house." He looked at Hepzibah. He let the silence ripen. On the 12th of September in the year 14, he read, in the dry voice of a man reading a writ, Miss Hepzibah Sackville, then 19 years of age, was joined in marriage at the parish church of St. Mary, in the village of Ashby-cum-Fenton, in the county of Leicester, to one Thomas Beavers, yeoman of that parish. The said marriage was solemnized by the Reverend Josiah Pole, vicar. The said marriage stands unannulled and undissolved upon the registers of that parish, as of this very week. A glass clicked against a plate. "Therefore," said Sir Roderick, lifting his eyes from the page, "the marriage subsequently contracted with His Grace the Duke of Rushmere is bigamous, void at law, and a fraud upon this realm." He folded the paper. He sat down. For one breath nobody moved. Then Lady Cordelia laughed. It was a small, clear note, almost musical. 2 other women joined it. The Marchioness of Stanhope leaned to her neighbor and said something behind her fan, and her neighbor's mouth opened into an O of delight. The Admiral, who had heard the word bigamous and very little else, said, "Eh? What?" Hepzibah set down her fork. She had never been to Ashby-cum-Fenton. She had never heard of Thomas Beavers. She had been in mourning for her father in September of 14, in a black gown her mother had altered, in a house in Bath whose every account she had still in her hand. She knew all of this with the calm certainty of a woman who has paid bills. It did not matter that she knew it. What mattered was the chair beside her. It was still empty. She looked the length of the table. She looked at Mrs. Linden, who was watching her with bright, fixed eyes. She looked at Lady Augusta, 4 places down, whose face had gone the color of cold ash, but whose hands on the cloth had not moved. She rose. She did not rise quickly. She rose the way she had been taught to rise from her father's parlor bench as a child, hand on the back of the chair, weight even, chin level. "Mrs. Linden," she said, and her voice carried, because the room had gone so quiet that even small voices carried. "I thank you for your hospitality. I have no answer to make to Sir Roderick at your table. A document is not a marriage. A reading is not a proof. If he has business with me, he may bring it before a court, where I shall meet him with mine." "Hear, hear," murmured Lady Augusta, low. "As for my husband," said Hephzibah, and here her voice did the only thing she could not quite govern, which was to drop a single tone. "His Grace will speak when His Grace chooses. I will not speak for him." She drew her gloves through her left hand. "Good evening." She walked the length of the table, past Lady Cordelia, who did not laugh now, past Mrs. Linden, who half rose, half did not, past the chair shaped like a swan. In the hall, the old butler had her cloak already across his arm. He had heard everything, as butlers always heard everything, and his face was the face of a man at a funeral he had not wished to attend. "A chair, Your Grace?" he said. "A hackney," she said. "Your Grace, if I may, Lady Augusta's carriage is—" "A hackney, please." He went out himself, without his hat, into Brook Street. He returned with one. He handed her in. She gave the driver Belvoir House and then, 3 streets later, leaned out and gave him a different direction. She did not go home. She went to the small house in Half Moon Street that had belonged to her father's sister, and now to her, the house Sir Roderick had not yet found a way to take, because it lay outside the Sackville settlement. The caretaker, an old woman who had nursed her at 6, opened the door in a nightcap and asked no questions. Hephzibah sat down in the front parlor in her cream silk and her seed pearls, and the caretaker brought her a cup of weak tea, and she held the cup between her gloved hands until it stopped shaking. He had not come. He had known. He had known there would be a paper and a reading and a table of faces, because he was not a stupid man, and he had read Sir Roderick from the first week. He had sent Ashworth to Lincoln's Inn instead of standing in the chair beside her. He had let her walk into Mrs. Linden's room alone in cream silk to be called a bigamist in front of the Marchioness of Stanhope. What he did not say was that he had not trusted her composure to hold if she had known he was breaking open a register clerk's desk at that very hour. Deep down, he had reasoned that her dignity at the table, untutored, was the only thing the Tun would later remember as true. She did not know any of that. She knew only the empty chair. She set the cup down. She took off her gloves, one finger at a time. She unpinned the seed pearls and laid them on the little table. She unhooked the small gold cross her mother had given her at 15 and laid that beside them. The caretaker watched from the doorway and said nothing. "Mary," said Hephzibah at last, in a voice quite level, "in the morning, before light, I should like a letter taken to Rushmere Hall. I shall write it tonight. I shall not be at Belvoir House when His Grace returns." "Yes, my lady." "And Mary?" "Yes, my lady." "Send word to Mr. Tilney at Gray's Inn. Tell him his old client's daughter has need of him before noon." The old woman dropped a careful curtsy and went out for paper and ink. Hephzibah sat alone in the front parlor of her aunt's house in Half Moon Street. The candle the caretaker had lit guttered once in the draught and steadied. Across the street, a watchman called the hour. It was 11. She had walked out of Mrs. Linden's table. She had refused to weep. She had sent for her own solicitor before her own husband had been told where she was. These were not the acts of a woman drowning. They were the small, hard choices of a woman who had decided, at the very floor of the well, that she would still choose. She picked up the pen. She wrote, very slowly, in her clear governess's hand, the first line of a letter she did not yet know how to end. "Your Grace, I write to you from my own roof, and I find I cannot return to yours until I understand whose silence I sat inside this evening." She set the pen down. She looked at the line. She did not cross it out. Somewhere across London, in a room above a chop-house in Chancery Lane, the Duke of Rushmere was reading a parish register by the light of 2 candles and a clerk's lantern, and the entry for the 12th of September in the year 14 was, he had just discovered, written in ink that had not yet had 3 years to dry. He did not know yet that his wife was not at home. In Half Moon Street, she folded the single line under a clean sheet and began the letter again. She wrote of the landau at 5 and of Sir Roderick's hat pressed against his ribs. She wrote of the swan-shaped napkin and of the paper with its 2 fresh seal. She did not write of the laughter. Laughter on paper always sounded smaller than it had been in the room. She wrote, near the end, 1 sentence more. I do not ask you to defend me. I ask you to tell me, plainly, whether you knew and whether you chose. She signed her name in full. Hephzibah Ann Sackville Heathcote. She had never signed it in full before, and the pen made a small blot at the last letter, which she did not scratch out. The blot, she thought, was honest. Mary took the letter at 4 in the morning and set out for the North Road with a boy from the Mews on the box beside her. Hephzibah did not sleep. She sat by the front window in her aunt's parlor, still in cream silk, still upright, and watched the sky over the rooftops of Piccadilly go from black to iron to the first pale gray of a July dawn. Somewhere, she thought, her husband was still bent over a parish register with a lantern. Somewhere Sir Roderick was drinking a second brandy and congratulating himself. Somewhere Lady Cordelia was telling the story again, better this time, and she was here. She was still here. She had walked, and she had chosen a hackney, and she had chosen a roof, and she had chosen a pen. Whatever came next, it would find her sitting up. The watchman below called 5. Hephzibah rose, went to the little writing desk, and drew a fresh sheet toward her for Mr. Tilney. The letter to Mr. Tilney went out with the dawn post, and by the evening of the same day, a black lacquered chaise turned into the drive of the small cottage on Half Moon Street, where Hephzibah had taken rooms. Mr. Tilney was a thin man, with a face like a folded map, and he carried a japanned box under his arm. He did not waste words. He set the box on the deal table, unlocked it, and lifted out a stack of pages tied with green ribbon. The originals, he said. Ashworth reached Lincoln's Inn in time. Sir Roderick had not yet burned them. Hephzibah put her hand flat on the topmost page and let it rest there. She did not read. She did not need to. She had known the shape of the truth since the note on the silver tray. What she had not known was that her husband had been running toward that truth even as she believed him standing still. How long has he had these? She asked. 3 days, madam. He rode back from Lincoln's Inn on Tuesday night and has not left his study except to inquire after you at every hour. She lifted her hand from the pages. The green ribbon was frayed at one end, as if it had been retied many times by nervous fingers. Tell him, she said, that I shall be at the ball on Thursday. Mr. Tilney inclined his head. He will wish to fetch you himself. He may. The chaise rolled away. Hephzibah sat a long moment with the box open before her. Then she rose, went to the little press in the corner, and took down a brown paper parcel Lady Augusta had sent that morning, without a word of explanation. She untied the string. Inside, folded in tissue, lay a gown the color of a peach at daybreak, Aurora silk with an empire waist and puffed short sleeves, a U-cut bodice trimmed in cream satin ribbon. Beneath it, wrapped in velvet, lay a smaller flat box she recognized without opening, the parure of sapphires that had belonged to the late Duchess. A card lay on top in Augusta's firm hand. He asks that you wear them. He does not ask that you forgive him. Those are 2 different requests, my dear, and only one is mine to press. Hephzibah folded the card and slid it into her sleeve. Thursday came with a thin rain that stopped by noon. By 6 the pavements of Mayfair were dry, and by 9 the great door of Belvoir House stood open under a canopy of blue silk. Carriages queued along the street. Footmen in powdered wigs handed down countesses in ostrich plumes, and inside the marble hall the chandeliers had been lit an hour early because Lady Augusta had wanted the light on the stairs. Hephzibah arrived alone. That had been her choice. She stepped from a plain hired chaise, gave her name to no one, and walked up the shallow steps with her cloak still fastened at the throat. In the little antechamber, Lady Augusta was waiting with 2 maids and a hand mirror. She said nothing about the previous fortnight. She only unfastened the cloak, tilted Hephzibah's chin, tucked a stray curl behind her ear, and set the sapphire drops in the small holes in her lobes with the practiced firmness of a woman who had dressed 100 brides. The clasp of the collar cooled the back of her neck. Augusta stepped back. Good, she said. Now walk. Hephzibah walked to the top of the great staircase. Below, the ballroom seethed. Silk moved against silk with a sound like distant leaves. Jonquil, rose, moss, ivory. 1,000 candles doubled themselves in the tall pier glasses. She placed one gloved hand on the balustrade and looked for him. He was already there. The Duke stood at the foot of the stairs in a black coat cut close, a gray silk waistcoat embroidered in black, his cravat plain, his cane of ebony resting against his boot. His hair had been brushed back from the pale scar over his eyebrow. He did not smile. He did not need to. He looked up at her as a man looks at a door he has been waiting all his life to see open. Beside him, on his left, stood a stranger in the sober black of the King's Bench, and beside that man, 2 officers in the red-lapelled coats of the sheriff's court. Their presence at the foot of a ballroom staircase was so improper that the nearest matrons had begun to whisper behind their fans, and the whispers were traveling outward through the room in rings, as when a stone falls in a pond. Sir Roderick Courtenay stood not 10 paces from the Duke. He had come uninvited and had not yet been asked to leave. His pasty face had gone the color of tallow. He was pretending to examine the pattern in the parquet. Lady Cordelia Beaulieu stood a little to the right in her jonquil silk, the diamonds in her hair catching the light, her painted fan half open. She had watched Hephzibah's arrival with the small, precise smile of a woman ready to laugh again. Hephzibah began to descend. She did not hurry. She had climbed stairs like these in half boots that leaked, in aprons stiff with flour, in a morning gown too heavy at the shoulder. She knew how to place a foot. The Aurora silk moved with her as if it had been cut by a hand that already loved her. At the 3rd step from the bottom she paused, because that was where the Duke had put out his arm. He did not speak. He only offered it. She laid her gloved hand upon his sleeve. At that moment the Lord Chamberlain, who had been briefed by Lady Augusta and Mr. Tilney with a thoroughness that no herald had ever received in the memory of Belvoir House, struck the parquet twice with his staff. The ballroom quieted. "Their Graces," he called, in the voice that had announced kings, the Duke and Duchess of Rushmere. Her Grace, Hephzibah Louisa Sackville Heathcote, sole heir of the late Colonel Edmund Sackville of Foxbourne, and inheritress in her own right, by decree of the Court of Chancery dated this 15th day of August, of the Sackville estate, in the sum of £12,000 per annum, all encumbrances set aside. The room did not gasp. It fell into that deeper thing that comes before a gasp. A held breath spread across 400 lungs. Somewhere near the orchestra, a lady's laugh had begun and did not finish. It broke in the middle of its note like a wineglass cracking on a hot dish. Lady Cordelia's fan closed with a small ivory clack. The Lord Chamberlain was not done, and I am charged, he continued, without looking at any face in particular, to make known that the said estate has stood these 7 years mismanaged in the hands of one guardian in Chancery, whose accounts have been this week examined by the King's Bench and found wanting. Sir Roderick Courtenay is required at once to attend the officers of the court. The 2 red-lapelled officers turned as one and walked, without haste, toward the corner where Sir Roderick had been trying very hard to be a piece of the wallpaper. He did not resist. He did not have the parts of a man who could resist. He only lifted his ink-stained hand as if he meant to adjust his spectacles and then let it fall. One officer took his elbow. The other lifted his leather satchel from beneath his arm and passed it, without ceremony, to Mr. Tilney, who had appeared at the edge of the crowd as quietly as a shadow. They walked him out through the side door. His shoes made an uneven sound on the marble. As he passed beneath the arch, the ink-stained fingers of his right hand searched for a spectacle frame that was no longer on his nose. An officer had already slipped it into a waistcoat pocket for safekeeping. He did not ask for it back. A dowager near the wall lowered her lorgnette. A colonel at the punch bowl set down his glass. In the musicians' gallery, a violinist wet the tip of his bow. No one spoke for the length of 6 heartbeats. Then the Duke turned to Hephzibah, and his voice, though pitched only for her, carried in the perfect silence to the 3rd row of onlookers. "I wanted you," he said, "before I knew." She looked up at him. Behind his cool gray eyes, something was shaking that had not shaken since Waterloo. "I know," she said. "I ought to have told you." "You ought. Will you dance?" It was not a question, and she did not treat it as one. She inclined her head, and he raised her hand to the level of his shoulder in the old way, and the orchestra, which had been waiting on a signal from Lady Augusta's fan, struck the first 3 notes of a waltz. They stepped into the center of the floor. The tun did what the tun always does at the moment history moves past it. It parted. It arranged itself into a circle 2 deep and then 3 deep, and it watched. Lady Cordelia had gone the color of her own pearls. She stood a moment in the ring, and then, because no one turned to speak to her, she turned herself and left. Her mother followed a step behind. The door closed after them very softly, as such doors do when the closing is final. Hephzibah did not see her go. She was looking up at her husband, and he was looking down at her, and the world at the edge of the floor had gone as unimportant as weather. His hand was warm through the glove at her waist. His knee, she felt, held. He was not favoring it tonight. He had learned somewhere in the last 3 days how to stand on it again. The Janellas, she said, because English was suddenly not quite enough. The windows, the west wing, opened, he said, all of them, and the roses under the windows are cut back. Ashworth had it done while you were away. You knew I would come home. I hoped. He turned her under his hand, and the Aurora silk lifted a little and fell. Lucius. Yes. You may keep the cane by the door, I do not mind it. He almost smiled then. Almost. It was the closest thing to a smile his face had made in 7 years of mourning and campaigns and ledgers, and she watched it come and go, like the first crocus through frost. The waltz ended. He did not release her hand. He walked her the length of the ballroom to where Lady Augusta stood with her granddaughters, and the Tun, having watched, went back to pretending it had not. Lady Augusta, from her chair at the edge of the floor, folded her fan and set it in her lap. She had waited 7 months for that folding. She permitted herself, briefly, a smile that no one saw except Mrs. Bramwell, who had been placed by Augusta's own hand in the front row of the household, and who dabbed at her eye with a corner of a plain white handkerchief. Mr. Ashworth stood by the pillar in his best brown coat, the ledger tucked under his arm from long habit. He had ridden 400 miles in 9 days to bring the Lincoln's Inn box into the Duke's study, and he was now content to lean on marble and watch the second dance begin. 3 weeks later, Sir Roderick Courtenay stood in the dock at the King's Bench and was convicted of embezzlement, forgery of chancery orders, and conspiracy to defraud a ward of the court. The house in Bedford Row went to the receivers on the same afternoon. His clerks scattered. His name was struck from the rolls of solicitors and from every club that had ever admitted him. He was sent, in the end, to a debtor's lodging in a town not worth naming, where he lived on a small allowance from a cousin who did not answer his letters. Lady Cordelia Beaulieu did not attend the second half of the season. Her name was quietly removed from Lady Augusta's list, and where Augusta's list went, the others followed. A match was arranged for her in the autumn, with a Scottish baronet of comfortable acres and no conversation, and she went north in a closed carriage. It was said in Mayfair that she had a headache. She had a headache for a great many years. Hephzibah did not attend the trial. She spent that morning in a small room off Fleet Street, with 2 young women from a parish workhouse and a slate. £6,000 a year of the recovered fortune had been settled by deed upon a school for mourning seamstresses, to be founded in the name of Colonel Edmund Sackville, so that a girl left with a needle and no name might not again be at the mercy of a guardian. Mrs. Bramwell had been named its first patroness, and had wept into her apron for the whole of an hour, and then set about ordering coal. By the end of September, the Duke and Duchess were at Rushmere Hall. The west wing stood open to the light. The sealed windows had been unpinned one by one, and the boards taken down, and the shutters folded back, and the rooms behind them aired for the first time in 7 years. The nursery had been swept. The music room had a new pianoforte. And at the end of the long gallery, the door that had been locked since the death of the 5th Duke's mother had been unlocked and left ajar. Lucius took her there on a bright afternoon, when the leaves had just begun to turn. He did not lean on the cane. He carried it in his left hand out of habit. The room beyond the door smelled of beeswax and lavender. A dressing table stood under the window. On its surface, laid out on a square of black velvet, was a second parure, not sapphires this time, pearls, warm and long, with a clasp of small diamonds shaped like a rose. These were hers, he said. She wore them the day she was married in this house. They are not an heirloom of the ducal estate. They were her own, and now they are yours. Hephzibah lifted the necklace. It was heavier than it looked. She set it down again. I shall wear them, she said, on the day we open the school. Good. He offered her his arm. She took it. They walked down the gallery and out through the tall doors at the west end and into the garden that had been a briar thicket in March. The rose beds had been cut back and staked. The gravel path had been raked. A late damask rose was in bloom against the south wall. He did not lean on her. She was too small for that, and they both knew it. But his hand rested on her wrist, as it had rested on the balustrade of the great staircase, and hers rested on his sleeve, and each was, in its own quiet way, the other's balance. At the end of the walk, he stopped and looked at her in the plain light of afternoon. "Say it," he said. "Say what?" "What you would not say in London." She looked up at him. The scar over his brow caught the sun. "You were the only one," she said, "who ever truly saw me." He bent his head. He did not kiss her mouth. He kissed the inside of her wrist, above the place where the black mourning ribbon had been, and where it was no longer. They walked back through the roses toward the house whose windows were, at last, all open to the light. If this story moved you, stop for a moment and reflect. Have you ever been the quiet person in the room mending someone else's grief while your own name was being erased in a lawyer's ledger? Have you ever waited, in a plain gray dress, for the world to see who you truly were? And when the whole ton laughed, would you have had the courage to walk down that staircase in the Aurora silk anyway? Tell us your experiences and feelings in the comments. We read them all. And if you believe in stories about dignity, justice, and love that arrives against all odds, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a part of our community and help the channel.